In the deep forest of South Africa, hidden from the world, there was a village called Mala. It was located between the majestic Drakensberg Mountains and the tranquil Sabi River. Mala thrived in complete isolation. Its people, descendants of the Ndebele tribe, had lived for centuries undisturbed by the outside world. This seclusion allowed their traditions to remain intact, passed down through generations. Their way of life had not changed since the 14th century, and they remained true to the customs of their ancestors. The most remarkable, and to outsiders, most unusual of this tradition was the villagers' practice of living without clothes. Men, women, and children walked freely in their natural state, unashamed and unconcerned. The women in particular sat and walked naked, performing daily tasks like weaving and cooking without any thought of covering up. This was their way of life, and they took pride in it. Elder Gosi, the village's leader and keeper of its oral history, was the protector of these ancient traditions. He told stories of their ancestors around the communal fire, teaching the younger generation about the gods and the land. His voice was a respected voice in the land, and the villagers listened to him in reverence. We are the children of nature, he would often say. In nature, there is no shame in our bodies. The gods see us as pure, and we must honor them by remaining as we were born. For centuries, Mala had remained hidden, its customs unchanged, but the winds of change were about to blow through this secluded village. Unknown to them, the outside world had taken notice. A stranger was coming, one who would challenge their way of life and bring change to their forgotten corner of the world. Far from the hidden village of Mala, in the bustling city of Johannesburg, Dr. Nala, an ambitious South African anthropologist, was deep in her research. She had always been fascinated about stories of ancient cultures and forgotten tribes. In one of her studies, she came across vague references to a secluded village hidden deep in the South African bushveld, where men and women were forbidden to wear clothes. This piqued her curiosity beyond measure. Dr. Nala's research led her to believe that Mala village still existed, untouched by modern civilization. She thought of discovering such a place where time seemed to have stood still. She knew she had to find it, not only to document their way of life, but also to understand the reasons behind such a unique custom. Equipped with old maps, some references from other anthropologists, and her unyielding determination, Dr. Nala embarked on a journey into the bushveld. She navigated through the dense forest, crossed rivers infested with crocodiles, and fought off swarms of tsetse flies that threatened to drain her strength. Her journey, which was supposed to take 2 weeks, stretched into several. She spent night under the open sky, listening to the sounds of the wild, all the while hoping she was on the right path. After weeks of searching, Dr. Nala finally reached the outskirts of a village, hidden between the Drakensberg Mountains and the Sabi River. It was exactly as the legends had described. She stood at the boundary of the village, marveling at the sights before her. People walking freely, without a stitch of clothing, going about their daily lives. The villagers noticed her, and silence fell over Mala. For the first time in centuries, an outsider intruded their space. This person was strange, all dressed up and looking different. The arrival of Dr. Nala brought uncertainty to Mala village. The villagers had never seen anyone from the outside world. Maybe their ancestors may have been visited once or twice from the outside world, but they had lived for generations, untouched and unknown. As they gathered around the stranger who had stumbled into their midst, there was curiosity, fear, and suspicion in their eyes. Dr. Nala remained calm. She understood the importance of her first interaction with the villagers. Any wrong move could cause them to retreat and shut her out completely. She raised her hands slowly, palms open, showing she meant no harm. Her heart pounded as she took her first step forward, smiling at the villagers. Elder Gosi, noticing the commotion, approached her, cautiously with sternness in his face. He stood tall among the villagers, who parted as he walked toward Dr. Nala. He stopped a few feet away from her, studying her carefully. The silence was thick. "Who are you? And why have you come to our village?" Elder Gosi's voice echoed. "I am Dr. Nala," she replied with a steady voice despite the tension. "I come from the outside world, but I have come only to learn. I have heard of your village and its great history. I mean no harm. I am here to understand, not to judge." The elder continued to study her. The villagers whispered among themselves, unsure of what to make of this newcomer. Dr. Nala held her breath, waiting for Elder Gosi's response. Finally, after a while, Elder Gosi nodded. "You may stay," he said quietly. "But remember, outsider, you are in the land of our ancestors. Respect our ways." Dr. Nala exhaled, relieved. Her journey into the heart of Mala had just begun. As the days passed, Dr. Nala began to settle into life in Mala village. The villagers, though still cautious, were slowly warming to her presence. She observed their daily routines, marveling at their connection to nature and their simple, harmonious way of life. Everyone moved freely without clothing. To Dr. Nala, their customs, while unusual, reflected a purity that was rare in the outside world. She was the only one who was dressed. In just a few weeks, she noticed that many of the villagers were falling ill. She had arrived at the village just at the time that this was beginning to happen. At first, it was just a few people, but within days, more and more people were bedridden with high fevers, shivering under blankets made from animal skins. The villagers were scared, and the fear in their eyes was undeniable. They had never dealt with such a widespread illness before, and their traditional remedies seemed to have little effect. Dr. Nala's instinct as a researcher and doctor kicked in. She knew this was no ordinary sickness. As she examined the villagers, she quickly realized they were suffering from a rare and severe strain of malaria. The symptoms were unmistakable: intense fevers, chills, and weakness. If left untreated, the village would face a devastating loss. Without hesitation, Dr. Nala rushed to her supplies. She had brought some anti-malarial medication with her, just in case she would need it for herself or anyone else, and now it was needed more than ever. She gathered the villagers, explaining the situation to Elder Gosi. "This is a sickness spread by mosquitoes," she explained. "I have medicine that can help, but we need to act quickly." Elder Gosi, though worried, gave his approval. Dr. Nala wasted no time administering the medication to the most vulnerable first, the children and the elderly. The villagers watched, hopeful but unsure. As the days went by, those who had been given the medicine began to recover. There was relief in the village, and for the first time, Dr. Nala was seen not as an outsider, but as a savior. After the epidemic subsided, Dr. Nala found herself in a new position in the village. She had earned their trust, something that seemed almost impossible when she first arrived. The villagers, once hesitant and weary about her presence, now looked at her with admiration and gratitude. Children, who had once hidden behind their parent when she walked by, now smiled at her openly. Women, especially those who had been ill, came to her to thank her. Elder Gosi, the ever-watchful protector of Mala's tradition, also softened towards her. He invited Dr. Nala to sit with him by the fire one evening, a place usually reserved for the elders of the village. It was a sign of great respect, and Dr. Nala accepted the gesture with humility. As they sat by the crackling fire, surrounded by the sounds of the night, Elder Gosi spoke. "You have helped us in a time of great need, Dr. Nala. We are grateful. But I must ask, what do you hope to gain from being here?" Dr. Nala paused, thoughtful. "I came here out of curiosity to learn about your way of life," she began. "But after seeing your customs, especially how your women live, I want to understand why. I want to help if I can." Elder Gosi nodded. His face was serious. "Our women have lived like this for centuries. It is what our ancestors decreed, that women must remain bare to show respect to men and to please the gods. We have never questioned it." Dr. Nala frowned. Her heart was heavy. She had seen how the women were limited, their worth tied to an ancient tradition that seemed to strip them of their dignity. She knew change would be difficult, but it was necessary. "I understand," she said softly, "but there is another way, one where women can be respected and still honor their ancestors." Elder Gosi stared into the fire, his silence signaling a deep contemplation. Change was coming, and Dr. Nala was determined to be its catalyst. As Dr. Nala continued her work in the village, she started talking more openly with the women of Mala. She learned that many of them had never questioned the tradition of remaining unclothed, as it had been ingrained in their culture since birth. They were told that it was a way to please the gods and respect their men, and to question this was to disrespect both the ancestors and their community. Before we continue our story, hit the subscribe button right now, please, and turn on post notifications so that whenever we make a post, you'll be the first to get notified. Please subscribe before we continue our story. Have you subscribed? Let's continue. But as Dr. Nala gently shared stories of the outside world, where women wore clothes without losing their respect or dignity, they became curious. The older women remained firm in their belief that the tradition was sacred, but some of the younger women, especially those who had recovered from the epidemic, began to express quiet doubt. They asked Dr. Nala what it was like to live in the modern world, to wear clothes, and to have choices. Dr. Nala could see the spark of change in their eyes. One day, she brought out some simple garment she had brought along, just to show them what was possible. The younger women were fascinated, touching the fabric and imagining themselves dressed in it. It was a small step, but for them, it felt revolutionary. However, not everyone was pleased with these new ideas. The men of the village, particularly the elders, noticed the growing interest in Dr. Nala's teaching. To them, the tradition of women being unclothed was not just a cultural norm, but a symbol of their control and authority. The women's bodies, they believed, were a gift from the gods, meant for the eyes of men, and to cover them would be to deny the will of the gods. Tensions began to rise. Some men started frowning at Dr. Nala's influence, and whispers of discontent spread through the village. Elder Gosi was caught in between preserving tradition and trusting Dr. Nala. It was a difficult position for him. "You are challenging what we have known for centuries," one of the elders warned Dr. Nala. "Be careful, or you will break what has kept our village whole." Despite the growing resistance, Dr. Nala remained patient. She knew that change would not come easily to a village steeped in centuries-old traditions, but she was determined. Every evening, she gathered the younger women and some of the more open-minded villagers to discuss the benefits of wearing clothes, not just for modesty, but for health protection and self-respect. The more she spoke, the more the women began to question the beliefs they had been raised with. They had lived in fear of displeasing the gods and their men, but Dr. Nala opened their eyes to a different way of thinking, one where one could still honor their ancestors while also embracing modernity. But as the women grew more intrigued, the men's discontent became more vocal. One evening, a group of men, led by one of the village elders, confronted Elder Gosi. "This outsider is poisoning our women," one man argued, with a harsh and angry voice. "She is teaching them to go against the gods and the ways of our ancestors. Very soon, our women will no longer respect us." Elder Gosi listened quietly. He had seen the changes Dr. Nala had brought to the village, and though he understood the concerns of his fellow men, he also recognized the positive impact she had made. The women were healthier, the children happier, and the village as a whole was benefiting from the knowledge she had shared. "We must adapt or we will be left behind," Elder Gosi finally said in a calm but firm tone. "Our ancestors did not fear change. They embraced it when it was necessary for survival. And now, we must do same." The elders' words sparked a heated debate. But for the first time, the men began to consider the possibility of change. While many still clung to the old ways, a shift in the wind could be felt. The power of tradition was strong, but the seeds of progress had been planted. Dr. Nala knew this was just the beginning of a long journey towards true change. Dr. Nala's persistence was beginning to pay off. One morning, a young woman named Lindiwe, who had become one of Dr. Nala's closest allies, took a bold step. She approached Dr. Nala and asked if she could try on one of the garments the doctor had brought. It was a simple dress made of light fabric, nothing grand, but to Lindiwe, it represented something far greater. The other women watched in awe as Lindiwe put on the dress. The transformation was striking, not because of the clothing itself, but because of what it symbolized: her willingness to challenge the customs and norms that had been passed down through generations. Lindiwe stood tall, unsure at first, but as she moved in the dress, her confidence grew. Dr. Nala smiled, offering her encouragement. "You look beautiful," she said softly, and for the first time, Lindiwe beamed with pride. The other women began to murmur among themselves. The news spread quickly through the village. By the afternoon, several more women had gathered around Dr. Nala, asking to try on the clothes she had brought. It was a quiet but powerful revolution. The women, who had always accepted their roles without question, were beginning to see themselves differently. But as more women embraced this new way of dressing, the men grew increasingly restless. Some of the younger men, like Gomoso, were supportive. But the older men, especially those who were tied closely to tradition, saw this as a direct challenge to their authority. They believed that the gods would punish them for allowing the women to break from custom. One evening, a group of men gathered outside Elder Gosi's hut, demanding that he put a stop to this madness. "This is not the way of our ancestors," one of the men said angrily. "We cannot allow this outsider to lead our women astray." Elder Gosi listened. His expression was solemn. He knew the situation was reaching a tipping point, but he remained calm. "We must tread carefully," he said. "Change does not come without resistance, but we must listen to both sides." The tension in Mala village was palpable. Dr. Nala sensed the unease among the villagers, and she knew that it was time to address the growing divide between the men and the women. She organized a village gathering under the great baobab tree, a place where important discussions had always taken place. The villagers began to arrive. Their faces had a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Elder Gussie stood beside her, a silent pillar of support. Dr. Nala stepped forward. "Thank you all for coming," she began. Her voice was steady. "I know there has been much discussion about the changes happening in our village, and I want to hear your thoughts." The men gathered on one side, their expressions serious, while the women, including Lindiwe, formed a circle around Dr. Nala. The atmosphere was thick with tension, and she could feel the weight of their expectations. One of the younger men, Gomoso, spoke first. "We see what you are trying to do, Dr. Nala, but our traditions are important to us. They define who we are." His voice was respectful but firm, echoing the sentiment of many. Dr. Nala nodded, appreciating his honesty. "I understand that traditions are crucial in shaping our identities. But what if we could evolve without losing what matters most?" A murmur ran through the crowd. The women nodded, exchanging glances, while some of the men frowned, deep in thought. Lindy then stepped forward. "Tradition does not have to mean suffering. We want to respect our ancestors, but we also want to choose how we live. Is it wrong for us to want dignity and respect while still honoring our culture?" Lindy's words struck a chord. The villagers began to engage in discussions, voicing their fears and hopes. Some men started to see the potential for a new way of life that did not erase their past, but rather built upon it. As the sun set, illuminating the faces of both men and women, it became clear that this gathering was a turning point. Change was no longer just an idea, it was a possibility, slowly taking root in the hearts of the villagers. People were still buzzing with excitement and discussions about the future of their community. Dr. Nala had proposed a compromise, a way to honor both tradition and the evolving needs of the village. She suggested that they create a new festival, one that celebrated their heritage while embracing change. This festival would showcase the beauty of both traditional attire and modern clothing, allowing the villagers to choose how they wanted to present themselves. Elder Gossi stood before the villagers, his presence commanding and respectful. "Let us remember that our ancestors thrived by adapting to the world around them," he began. "Change is not an enemy, it is a part of life. We can find a balance that respects our past and prepares us for the future." Encouraged by the elders' words, Lindiwe and the other women proposed organizing workshops to teach sewing and designing. They wanted to create clothes that reflected both their cultural identity and individual expression. The men, too, began to discuss how they could support this initiative, understanding that empowering women would strengthen the village as a whole. As the preparations for the festival began, the entire village came together, collaborating in ways they had never done before. Laughter echoed through the fields as men, women, and children walked side by side. Dr. Nala watched, her heart swelling with pride at the transformation unfolding before her eyes. On the day of the festival, the village was alive with color and joy. Traditional drums beat rhythmically as villagers wore beautiful garments, both traditional and modern. The air was thick with the scent of delicious food, laughter, and music, drawing everyone together in celebration. As Dr. Nala stood amidst the festivities, she realized that Mala village had taken its first bold steps towards a brighter future. They were not just preserving their traditions, but also redefining them, embracing a new identity that honored both their past and the potential for growth. Dr. Nala felt a sense of belonging. In that moment, Dr. Nala knew that Mala village was no longer just a research site, but it had become a part of her heart. What did you learn from this story? All right. So, what did you learn from this story? Share it in the comment section. And please subscribe to this channel right now and turn on post notification so that whenever a story is posted, you'll be the first to get notified and you'll be the first to watch. Like and share this. Don't forget to drop your lessons in the comment section. Subscribe and see you in our next story. Bye bye.